Hey everybody, Mr. Moonlight here, and I am going to talk about an unpopular opinion that I have, and I've actually found an article that agrees with me, and that is the Star Wars prequels are good. I am not a fan of Disney Star Wars at all, although The Mandalorian, that looks like it could be good, so, we'll see. I do want Star Wars to be successful, and I do understand why Star Wars is not successful at the moment, and there are a lot of videos on YouTube already talking about that. But today we're going to read this article. I have not read this article yet, so let's hop into it, and I'll just kind of comment along. This is from Naboo News WordPress, so this is a blog, a WordPress blog about Star Wars. I assume I just came across it on Facebook, so let's see what it has to say. Screen Rant. The Star Wars prequels need to be understood, not fixed. So right there, yeah, I'm on board. Let's see what else they have to say. Is this from Screen Rant, I guess? As Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker quickly approaches to usher in the end of the Skywalker saga, we'll see, and fans are still locked in a heated debate over Star Wars: The Last Jedi, it's time to look back once again to another controversial Star Wars debate, the prequels. By the way, I was watching Revenge of the Sith last night and quite enjoyed it still. Now that we're 20 years, separated from the release of Star Wars: The Phantom Menace, the debate over whether or not the prequels are good or bad is beyond tiring, but regardless of the actual cinematic quality of the prequels, their importance to the franchise can't be overstated. I'm going to stick up for the quality. We'll get into that. With numerous books and cartoons bringing additional clarity to the prequels in recent years, many people have said Lucasfilm is fixing the prequels, and while it is true this additional canon material has helped fans come to a better understanding of the story of the prequels, saying it fixes the prequels suggests that they were fundamentally broken in the first place, which is just untrue. I don't care about additional materials. What do they call it? Transmedia. Movies stand on their own. And even sequels have to stand on their own. A good sequel should be something that maybe you don't have all the information, but you can watch and understand what's going on without having seen what came before or having any idea of who the characters are or anything, but there is an exception, which is the Marvel movies, which I'm going to do a separate video about, because I realize that the Marvel movies are not meant to be watched as individual movies. But again, that's another video. The prequels are misunderstood. Since the prequels have come and gone, Star Wars fans have already gone through another cycle of the highs and lows of a Star Wars franchise revival. The Phantom Menace was coming after over a decade and a half without Star Wars movies to tell the story of how the galaxy got to where we find it in the state of Episode 4, Star Wars: A New Hope. What everyone expected at the time was a return to the Star Wars they loved, but George Lucas did something entirely different. When Star Wars: A New Hope, or just Star Wars at the time, was released, it was heavily influenced by Akira Kurosawa, Flash Gordon serials, and John Ford westerns, all wrapped up in a lived-in futuristic post-World War II aesthetic. But the prequels struck a very different look and feel. Yes, this is something that again, I think the new movies don't get, because the new movies are trying to give the same aesthetic as the original trilogy. When the prequels came out, taking into account that we're viewing this as a real universe rather than a fictional one, I think that it's important to note that this is, somebody who lived in that time and then lived long enough to see the New Hope era, would look back and go, well, it was a different time. Things were a lot different back then. The world we lived in was a lot different. We had the best of everything. We had the best technology. And, the world of A New Hope, it's kind of degenerated. They're falling back on old technology, just like when a first world culture is kind of taken over by a more authoritarian culture, like the example that comes to mind at the moment is Venezuela. Venezuela's kind of had to fall into this third world status after being a first world country. And I kind of see that's what the prequels were. They were the first world Star Wars universe, and A New Hope is kind of after that authoritarian regime has caused a collapse, a halt in progress, a dilapidation of the world that we live in. So it absolutely makes sense that the prequels would look and feel a lot different. Also, this is the time of the Jedi, when Force users were a lot more common. They hadn't all been slaughtered, and their codes, their way of doing things, just like, they're not exactly like feudal lords, but I'll use that as an example because they were kind of based on samurai. But we don't live in a feudal world anymore. But they had their traditions and their way of doing things, and again, things have changed. So anyway, let's where did I leave off? Okay, so taking place 3 decades before the events of the original trilogy, yet created a decade and a half after Star Wars Return of the Jedi, Star Wars The Phantom Menace not only takes place in a galaxy entirely untouched by the turmoil that led to the rise of the Empire and the world where we are introduced to in the Star Wars original trilogy, but also derives different story and design inspirations. While the Kurosawa and John Ford inspiration doesn't vanish, Star Wars: A Phantom Menace and other prequels leaned way more into the Flash Gordon inspiration, also getting heavy influence from works like Isaac Asimov's Foundation books. Oh yeah, there's Coruscant is right out of Foundation. There is an all city planet. Anyway, and fittingly leans into Shakespearean drama to tell the story of the collapse of the Republic. Almost everything in the original trilogy was old and lived in, but the prequels roll the clocks back a few decades to introduce designs that also take influence from a few decades earlier in the real world, while also including a less worn down version of many of the trappings of the original trilogy. So I guess I'm kind of being redundant. Like I said, I haven't read this yet, so I wanted to do immediate reactions as I read it. The movies looked and felt different, but that was because the universe actually was different. Yes, I found my spirit soulmate here, maybe. It wasn't yet savaged by the conflict of the Clone Wars. The Republic hadn't been taken over by a Sith Lord and turned into a galactic empire. The Rebel Alliance hadn't yet started a galactic civil war against the Empire. The characters that inhabited that world were also far less cynical, even naive, particularly the Jedi as a result. Yes, it's a lot about arrogance. It's a lot about becoming complacent in the world you live in, and living in such comfort as to when evil things happen, you say to yourself, well, that can't happen here. Yoda was kind of wise to it, but even he got tricked. The phrase special something or magic are thrown around to describe what made Star Wars so special, and many people claim the prequel trilogy lacked that. And while discussions could be had and have for 20 years now about the dialogue and acting and the quality of the VFX, it really comes down to the expectations. The dialogue, acting, and VFX in the original trilogy are also imperfect many times, and it didn't all age perfectly either. The difference is the prequels were saddled with expectations before anyone had even seen a single frame of the movie. So yes, I don't understand people who complain about the special effects in the trilogy, in the prequel trilogy. I thought they were excellent. They really were kind of, and this is, listen, I'm sure you look at the special effects now and some of the really great stuff from the new Planet of the Apes series, and some of the excellent effects that have come to light in terms of, hey, even was it The Force Awakens, what's her name? the Yoda substitute woman. Mas Kanata, was that it? Anyway, they look fantastic. They really do. But even those I'm already starting to see age. What I love about the effects in the prequels is that, yes, some of them were imperfect, but again, there were so many miniatures built. People always think it was all CGI, and that's because of the PR of the time. There were so many miniatures. There were so many makeups. There were so many set pieces and props. But they were blending it with new digital green screen technology. I believe that the Attack of the Clones was one of the early digitally shot movies. But they had such innovation. There was so much craftsmanship and artistry that went into creating all of those effect shots, and pretty much the entire movie, like shot after shot, was an effect shot. But they were breaking new ground. They were trying new things, and it gave it an energy and a life that to this day I think is beautiful. One of the other things I must, like I said, I was watching the opening sequence of Revenge of the Sith, and it was so colorful. They were really bold with their colors. Looked really beautiful. It looked kind of dreamlike. It wasn't 100% realistic, but it was still more beautiful to look at. These days, everyone's going for, like, Rogue One. My God, everything looks gray and shabby and just, and they went for realism, and they did a great job, but who cares? It's, like, so uninteresting to look at. There was hardly a single thing in there that if I was a kid, I would have wanted to buy as a toy. But man, like General Grievous and that battle in the atmosphere, it looked gorgeous. So yeah, I mean, there may have been some dated effects in there, but honestly, looks fantastic. And I think it always will, despite its flaws, just like with the original trilogy. But the more we push for realism, the more that's all we're getting. We're getting realism, but we're not getting any kind of design and aesthetic. No one's pushing the designs and pushing the aesthetics and trying to break new ground. And ultimately, no matter how realistic you make it, it doesn't age well, and it ceases to be exciting. So anyway, continuing on with the article, we're still suffering the fallout of the initial prequel reaction. By the way, you know what? When I saw the prequels at first, I was kind of over Star Wars. I didn't see it having the cultural impact that it did. The prequels got me back into Star Wars, and I went into them fully expecting to hate them. So maybe that's also where, I don't know, like, that maybe I had a slightly different perspective. As Lucasfilm and Disney constantly emphasized the use of real sets and practical effects on the sequel trilogy, but the prequels also had an abundance of practical sets and effects, thank you, even more than the original trilogy, in fact. And while detractors have picked apart low points in the VFX of the prequels in the decades since their release, much of the prequels' use of CGI goes entirely unnoticed because of how well it stood up. The prequel backlash, therefore, is rooted way more in expectations driven from a nostalgic view of the original trilogy, as well as misunderstanding of what Lucas was even going for in episodes 4, 5, and 6 in the first place. More on that later. Oh, I've got comments, but should I keep reading? Again, it's a different kind of story, but let's keep reading and see if they make the points before I do. The Star Wars prequels never needed fixing to be understood. Looking at the abundance of news stories that help contextualize and explain what was happening in the prequels often leads many fans to say the extra canon material fixed the prequels, but that makes the assumption that this level of nuance wasn't already present in the films themselves, when in fact the stories aren't already presented in the prequels, but the subversive nature of the story is even set up in the original trilogy. Anakin was rejected by the Jedi from his first appearance in front of the Jedi Council. After examining him and confirming his abilities, the Council pushed back against Qui-Gon's desire to train him, and Anakin never forgot that. Getting off on that wrong foot led to him misunderstanding the Jedi's stance on many things, including their views of love and attachment. When he's falling in love with Padme and having a nightmare about his mother, the council isn't helpful, simply telling him he needs to be willing to let go of the things he's afraid of losing. And through it all, the only person other than Obi-Wan Kenobi who praises Anakin's powers, trusts his judgment, and offers aid is Supreme Counselor Sheev Palpatine. Is that his first name? I never knew that. Am I even pronouncing that right? Sheev? Chef? Hello, children. So when matters ultimately force Qui-Gon to side with the Jedi, that leaves a Sith Master as the only person who has been empathetic or expressed a desire to help Anakin in his struggles. This is a major failing in the Jedi, and it's not something that comes out of left field. Obi-Wan Kenobi may have declared that the Jedi were guardians of the peace and justice in the galaxy for 1,000 generations, but that doesn't mean the Jedi were right in the prequels. In fact, the original trilogy is a condemnation of the old Jedi, Obi-Wan and Yoda, who tell Luke the only path to victory is to kill Darth Vader. Luke ultimately rejects the ideology. The previous generation of Jedi at the end of Star Wars, Return of the Jedi, the same ideology that led to the fall of the Jedi and the rise of the Sith. I feel like I read that wrong. And it's through his refusal to kill Darth Vader that ultimately serves as the demonstration of love Anakin Skywalker needed all along, bringing him back from the dark side to apparently temporarily defeat Palpatine and overthrow the Empire. Ooh, yeah, little side jab there to the new Star Wars movies, and it's not unjustified. Unfortunately, this kind of reflection wasn't in high demand when George Lucas made the prequel trilogy, so it wasn't until years later that when other material pointed out the nuance that already existed in the storytelling of the prequels that they finally started to gain mainstream acceptance. And now we live in a day and age 20 years after the release of the Star Wars The Phantom Menace, where the prequels have never been more highly regarded. And there you go. Good article. I really feel this is spot on. I'm kind of shocked that this nuance was missed by audiences. Is that what happened? I saw it. I definitely saw the failing of the Jedi, and I certainly saw how the prequels really tied into the themes of the original trilogy. And this is the problem that Disney Star Wars is having. They think that let me kind of take it back a notch here for a second. There is a documentary called The Prequels Strike Back, A Fan's Journey. I actually was interviewed. I'm featured in it for a short amount of time talking about the prequels. But and I'll see if I can link to it if you want to get it in the description. I guess I'm kind of shilling for it at the moment, but it is actually a really good documentary, and it explains this other internet fan theory called ring theory, where everything comes full circle. Now, if you have any knowledge of writing, which if you're listening to me talk, I assume is something that interests you, because this is all about storytelling in movies, and if you're a filmmaker, you want to know about this. Even if you're not a screenwriter, as a director, you want to know and understand about this. But everything comes full circle in stories. If you've seen the hero's journey illustration, of where a hero starts, how they kind of have a call to adventure, and there's a form of kind of occurrence that changes their worldview, and they have to go down into kind of like the darkest hour, and then come back up a changed person, where they come back around to where they started with new knowledge, new skills, information to defeat the problem that they started with. That is all present in the prequels. Star Wars is the story of the Skywalker family. I'm not saying that there aren't other stories that can't take place in the Star Wars universe. I think the Clone Wars are an excellent example of how you can do that. The Clone Wars add a lot, and it's a great series, to the adventures of Obi-Wan and Anakin and Ahsoka and Yoda and a bunch of the other characters. But ultimately, when it comes to the story of Star Wars, it is the story of Anakin Skywalker and how he is saved and redeemed by the act of love that originally took him down. His desire to love and to care about people, and that being kind of taken for granted led to him turning to the dark side. But the product of his love, his children, led also to saving him and redeeming him and giving him a legacy, giving his family a legacy that he himself almost destroyed or did destroy. So when you come up with a new trilogy, the Disney trilogy, I mean, it's really lost because they have no way of tying it in, or they could have had a way of tying it in by creating stories about the next generation and seeing how the next generation, is kind of growing up in the rebuilding or the rebirth of a new republic, and how they have to fight to preserve that against forces that may, not have a good sense of history, and want to just repeat the mistakes as we see in our own world. But we got this other thing that is just kind of this lost meandering of these characters that don't evolve. They don't, Rey is essentially, she starts out having all the skills and she just beats everyone handily, and including Luke Skywalker, a Jedi Master. She gets into a fight with him and bests him handily without having, and she's supposed to be training from him. It's just, it's just meandering and it goes nowhere. And it's why they're failing so badly to capture the imagination of modern audiences. And honestly, Star Wars is heavily reliant on the people who were original fans of these stories, because now these kids have other things. They've got the Marvel movies, and I don't think they care about Star Wars as much. They're not holding on to it as much. They're going to Star Wars land because their parents are taking them. They're getting Star Wars toys because their parents are like, I love Star Wars. I want to share this with my kids. But, my kids are not into. I put on a Star Wars movie last night. I put on the Clone Wars series. I put on, they leave the room. I mean, they don't like run screaming like they do when I put on the Science Channel, but it doesn't hold the same magic for them, because these movies started as a product of their time, and it was not our kids' time, it was our time. So we have stronger feelings about it. If we can't realize what's going on in modern storytelling and realize what they did in the past that was so successful, even with the prequels, and why the prequels are getting new appreciation, they're going to lose that following entirely. And come on, let's just admit it right now. Disney makes their money, makes their long-term money, gets their following by grooming us. They groom us to love this stuff at a young age, so when they bring it back out when we're older, we buy it again. But if they're failing to groom the next generation because they're trying to just use what worked before without realizing why it worked and why people were so attracted to it. So, 20 years from now, or 10 years from now, or whatever, I'll say 20 years from now. 10 seems like a short amount of time. When they pull out, hey kids, remember Kylo Ren and Rey? People are like, yeah, kind of sucked. So anyway, I kind of went off on a tangent, but thanks for following me on this article. I enjoyed reading it. I think it pretty much hits the nail on the head. Oh, one last thing I was going to say about the Star Wars prequels that did not get hit on here. They mentioned Flash Gordon, yes, and that is very much the style of the prequels. It's like the old serials, and I think that's one of the reasons why it didn't hit with people at the time. Just like I was talking about with the Disney stuff, George Lucas was a fan of the serials. There was very specific acting styles involved in those Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers serials. There was they played out a certain way, and George Lucas was trying to do an homage to those. But unless you loved those serials and understood them, you might watch the way, the acting choices, the storytelling choices, and go, yeah, that was unusual. Why did he do that? It's not that it's bad. It was a stylistic choice that I think people didn't understand. But it got mistaken for being bad, just like a lot of people mistake soap operas for being bad, even though soap operas, those actors can't act. No, they act just fine. Soap operas have a certain style to them, and if you try and deviate from that style, you lose people. So, this is something that could get covered. I recommend the prequel Strike Back. I also Camille Paglia, I think is how you say her name. She's a very famous feminist professor. She wrote a thing about how she felt that modern movies lack emotion, and the Star Wars prequels had more emotion in the last 10 minutes of the Revenge of the Sith than a dozen modern movies have in them, and that the emotional quality, the emotional resonance of the movie is something we could all learn from. So George Lucas did a great job of plotting these stories. They are very well done stories. We could all learn something from them. It's just that because of the style that they were done in, and because Lucas does have some weak points in the way he does things, I'm sure the prequels all could have done with another draft. But I think it's all there. All the strengths are there, and I love them. I enjoy them. They're adventurous. They're fun. They're never boring. They're unique to look at. They are cool movies. I wish we had more movies that had this kind of spirit. So anyway, thanks for listening, and please make sure to subscribe, or make sure you're still subscribed. Hit the notification bell, hit the like button, share it with your friends, and I will be back. I think my next video will be about how to watch Marvel movies. Take care, everyone.